Malik, the quiet kid everyone overlooked, was suddenly called to present by his teacher, hoping he'd embarrass himself. But just minutes later, the whole class was on their feet clapping, and the teacher stood speechless. What really happened on that classroom stage that day? Malik Johnson was a 12-year-old boy living in Cincinnati, Ohio. Every morning, he carefully tucked his worn-out notebook into his faded backpack and quietly stepped into his classroom at Lincoln Heights Middle School. No one noticed. No one said his name. He moved through the halls like a shadow, present but barely seen. He didn't mess around, didn't talk much, and definitely wasn't the kind of student teachers remembered. He lived in a small apartment with his mom and grandmother, where paying rent every month was a constant worry. His mom worked night shifts as a nurse, and his grandmother, the one who first taught Malik how to write, was now frail and forgetful. Still, Malik always finished his assignments early, with neat handwriting and thoughtful words, but no one ever seemed to mention that. In class, he was that bookworm kid, a nickname thrown around by classmates with a mix of mockery and boredom. Miss Valerie Kent, their strict and stone-faced English teacher, had never once called on him all semester. Every time Malik raised his hand, her eyes would skim past like wind, never landing, never stopping. He had grown used to it, used to being overlooked, but inside him was a whole world, stories waiting to be told, quiet sadness no one had ever asked about, and a voice that had never truly been heard. Until one day, everything changed, when Miss Kent, for reasons only she knew, decided to drag Malik into the spotlight. No warning, no preparation, and certainly not because she believed he'd shine. It was Monday. The sky was gray. Malik sat quietly in the back row by the window, flipping through his small notebook. Not the one for classwork, but the one where he wrote everything he couldn't say out loud. That notebook held thoughts, stories, emotions. It was his world, one no one else ever asked about. Up front, written in big white chalk on the board, presentation week, topic of your choice. Below it, a blank student list. Normally, Ms. Kent would let students volunteer or start with the louder, more confident kids, but today was different. No sign-up sheets, no random selection, just her sharp gaze scanning the room, calm and cutting like a blade. She flipped through her gradebook, paused and looked up. "We'll begin with someone special," she said, her voice even, but loaded. "Malik Johnson." A ripple of surprise rolled through the room. Heads turned. "Him?" Someone whispered. "Dude doesn't even talk." Another snickered. Malik looked up, blinking slowly. He didn't ask, "Why me?" He didn't argue. He simply closed his notebook, stood up and walked to the front of the class. His steps were quiet, but his heart pounded like a drum. That old feeling was back, being dragged into the spotlight, not because someone saw his light, but because they expected him to fail. Miss Kent folded her arms across her chest, leaning against the desk. "Any topic you like," she said. "You've got 5 minutes. Begin." No prep, no warning, no encouragement. Malik stood in front of the whiteboard, the classroom camera's red light blinking steadily. For the first time all year, every eye was on him, but not with support, more like waiting for a car crash, for Malik to mess up. He swallowed, then slowly pulled a folded scrap of paper from his shirt pocket. It wasn't a speech, no title, no fancy opening, just a few lines he'd scribbled in silence. "People think silence means weakness," Malik began, his voice calm but clear. "That if you don't speak, don't laugh, don't raise your hand, then maybe you've got nothing worth saying." The room hushed, a different kind of silence now, not boredom, curiosity. I used to think that too. I thought if I stayed quiet, no one would tease me, no one would look at me, no one could hurt me. Malik paused, glanced down at his note, then back up. "But then I realized, when you stay quiet too long, people start to believe you've got nothing to say. And worse, you start believing it too." The heat from the camera lights seemed to rise, but Malik didn't back down. His voice steadied. "There are people in this class who've never spoken to me. Some called me names, bookworm, ghost, nothing. And there are people, adults, who teach this class, who've never really seen me at all." Behind Miss Kent's glasses, something flickered. Discomfort? Guilt? No one could tell. "I'm not up here to complain. I'm here because everyone has a story. But if no one ever invites you to tell it, how will they know it matters?" Malik folded the paper and slipped it back into his pocket. He didn't need to read anymore. This wasn't a speech on paper. This was something he'd carried in his heart for a whole year. "And if this is the only time I ever get to speak, then I'll say this." He paused, letting his eyes scan the room. "Don't ask why someone's silent. Ask why you never tried listening." The silence in the room deepened. No laughter, No whispers. Only one thing was certain. No one expected Malik, the boy they never noticed, to be the one who just said what no one else dared to. After Malik spoke his final words, the room fell into a strange kind of silence. No one laughed. No one moved. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to freeze. A few glances were exchanged, some awkward, some stunned, but all eyes remained on one person, the boy who, just moments ago, had been the invisible one. Malik stood there, hands at his sides. He didn't smile, he didn't bow, he simply stood still, as if he just emptied out everything he'd been carrying all year long. Inside, his heart was pounding, his breath short, his chest tight, but outside he looked calm, steady, almost untouchable. Then from the back of the room, a slow clap rang out, soft, hesitant. It was Aiden, the same kid who used to tease Malik relentlessly. One beat, then another, then a third. The clapping spread like a ripple, scattered at first, then building. Within seconds, the entire class was on their feet, clapping, cheering. Someone shouted, "He killed it." "Dude, that was fire. I've never heard anything like that." The quiet kid, the one nobody noticed, now stood in the spotlight, seen, heard, respected. But one person wasn't clapping. One person hadn't said a word, Miss Valerie Kent. She stood near her desk, arms folded across her chest, eyes locked on Malik, not cold this time, but unreadable. In that moment, something flickered behind her glasses. Conflict, guilt, maybe even shame. Then she spoke, voice flat and measured. "Your presentation, emotional, but lacking structure. You should focus more on technique if you want to improve." The room shifted. The applause slowed. A few students exchanged glances. Malik didn't respond. He just met her gaze. No longer the timid boy in the back, but someone who now knew exactly who he was. After a pause, Emily, one of the top students in class, stepped forward, the teacher's favorite. "With all due respect, Miss Kent, I think you're wrong. That was the most powerful thing I've ever heard in this class." Then Jaden spoke up. "I used to think Malik was just boring. Turns out I was the one not paying attention." Heads nodded. A few soft yes followed. The room, once silent in dismissal, now stood in quiet solidarity with Malik. Miss Kent stayed silent. Her hand gripped the edge of her desk. Her face had lost its usual stillness. For the first time in years, she seemed unsure, exposed even. Malik held her gaze a moment longer. He didn't say a word. Then he turned and walked back to his seat. Each step felt lighter, as if something had shifted, not just in the room, but in him. He sat down. Across from him, Tyler, his only real friend, gave him a slow, approving nod. A small but genuine smile tugged at Malik's lips. He nodded back. At the front, Miss Kent flipped open her lesson plan, pretending to read, though she hadn't turned a single page. After a moment, she cleared her throat. "Let's move on with the lesson." But the classroom didn't return to normal. Not yet. The silence that lingered now wasn't hollow. It was full of respect, of realization, and something no one wanted to admit out loud. Something had changed. The lesson went on. Or at least Miss Kent tried to pretend it did. She flipped through her lesson plan and called out the next section like nothing had happened. But something had, and everyone felt it. No one was taking notes. No one was really looking at the board. Sure, they were sitting upright, eyes forward, but their minds were still back in the moment Malik had just created. The room felt thicker somehow, like the air itself had changed, like a window had shattered, and the silence was still hanging in the air like pieces of glass. Malik sat quietly at his desk, hands resting on his notebook. He didn't write anything. He didn't have to. Something inside him had shifted. Not loud, not obvious, but deep. For the first time, he could feel it. He was no longer invisible. Up front, Emily kept turning around to glance at him, her expression now one of quiet respect. Jaden, the same kid who used to laugh the loudest, was now silent, pretending to scribble, but sneaking looks at Malik like he wanted to say something, and couldn't find the words. From the side, Tyler just nodded slowly, a tiny smile on his face. It wasn't surprise. It was pride, like he'd always known this version of Malik existed, and now the rest of the class finally saw it too. Then Miss Kent spoke again, her voice steady, controlled. "All right, moving on. Let's review argumentative structure. 3 paragraphs, clear thesis, supporting points." Her tone hadn't changed, but something was missing. That automatic authority, the kind teachers rely on without thinking, it wasn't landing the same. Malik looked up. For the first time all year, he looked directly at her, not nervously, not seeking approval, but with quiet certainty. And for a split second, she looked back, not past him, not through him, at him, just a flicker. But gone was the condescension. Gone was the indifference. In its place, a kind of awareness, maybe even regret. When the bell rang, the usual shuffle of chairs and scraping desks filled the room. Normally, kids would rush out, laughing, shouting. Today, they moved slower. Eyes still trailed back to Malik's desk as they passed. Brandon, one of the cool kids, paused beside Malik on his way out. He didn't look directly at him, didn't crack a joke. He just muttered, "Didn't think you had that in you, but mad respect." Then he walked off, short, simple. But coming from Brandon, that meant more than applause. Malik didn't respond, just nodded quietly. He started packing up his things when, "Malik." It was Miss Kent. He turned around. She was standing by her desk, one hand resting on her lesson planner, the other hanging by her side. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking out the window, her voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. It seemed like she wanted to say something. Her expression had softened, like some invisible armor had finally cracked. 1 second, 2. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. No apology, no praise. Finally, she said, "I hope you understand. This is still my classroom." Malik didn't flinch. He didn't feel angry or disappointed. He just nodded, calm as ever, and replied, "I know. But today, the class heard me." Then he turned and walked out. Not fast, not slow, but steady. Every step felt lighter, like he was walking out of more than just a room. He was walking out of an old version of himself, leaving behind the weight of being unseen. That afternoon, Malik didn't take the school bus like he usually did. He walked. His backpack hung loosely over one shoulder, and the cool breeze tugged at his hair as thoughts swirled quietly in his head. No one said anything to him after class, but their eyes had. The same people who once looked right through him now paused, even just for a second, and somehow that pause meant everything. He turned the corner and stepped into the local convenience store, the one on 12th and Maple. The bell above the door jingled softly. Mr. Henson, the elderly shop owner with graying stubble and sharp eyes, looked up from behind the counter. "You look lighter today, Malik," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Malik froze for half a second, then gave a small smile. "Maybe I finally dropped something I'd been carrying too long." Mr. Henson nodded, like he already knew. He didn't press further. Malik grabbed a bottle of water and paid quietly. There was something in Mr. Henson's gaze, like he was proud, even if he didn't say it out loud. By the time Malik reached home, the golden light of late afternoon stretched along across the front porch like honey. The small apartment he shared with his mom and grandmother wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, a creaky front door, but it always smelled like something good was cooking. He dropped his backpack by the door and collapsed into the wooden chair at the kitchen table. From the stove, his mom turned around. She was flipping crispy chicken thighs in their old cast iron skillet, her hair tied up, a light sheen of sweat on her forehead. "You're home later than usual," she said, not accusing, just curious. Malik looked up and answered quietly, "A lot happened today." His grandmother sat in the old rocking chair near the window, knitting. Her eyesight had faded over the years, but somehow she could still sense everything that mattered. "Did you just walk out of the darkness, Malik?" she asked, half teasing. He smiled, the first real smile of his day. "I think I did." His mom turned off the stove, wiped her hands on a kitchen towel, and sat across from him. His grandmother stopped knitting. All 3 of them now sat around the round wooden table, old, scratched, but full of stories from meals past. "You want to talk about it?" his mom asked gently. No pressure, just an open door. And this time Malik nodded. He told them everything, not rushed, not filtered. He talked about Miss Kent's eyes, the mocking looks from classmates, how he got called up with no warning, and the words he finally let out, words he never thought anyone would hear. His mom listened, never interrupting. Her eyes stayed fixed on his face, tracking every little shift in his expression. His grandmother nodded here and there, smiled softly, or let out a quiet sigh. No one rushed him. No one filled the silence. They just listened. When Malik finished, the room stayed quiet, but it wasn't an empty quiet. It was full of understanding. Finally, his mom spoke. "You did the right thing. Sometimes you don't wait for someone to give you permission to speak. You just speak. And when you do, people have no choice but to listen." His grandmother reached over and gently squeezed Malik's hand. Her voice, low and warm, said, "Our boy's not the quiet one anymore." Malik smiled, feeling something new rising inside him, like a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years, like a seed breaking through the dirt, finally catching sunlight. It wasn't about praise. It wasn't about attention. It was about knowing, deep down, that he was finally being seen. The next morning, the sky was clear after a soft night rain. Malik walked into class just like he always did. Not too fast, not too slow, just a seventh grader with his old backpack and the same well-worn notebook tucked under his arm. But this time, the difference wasn't in his steps. It was in the way people looked at him when he passed. Gone were the glances that slid past him like he didn't exist. Gone were the lowered eyes, the smirks, or the muttered jokes. In their place were quiet nods, uncertain but sincere eye contact, and even a few smiles. Jaden, who used to mock him openly, tapped the desk lightly as Malik walked by. "Hey, what you said yesterday, that was actually pretty dope." Malik nodded politely, but inside something light stirred. It wasn't the compliment that mattered. It was the fact that someone who never listened had finally heard him. He took his usual seat next to Tyler. Tyler flipped open his notebook, then leaned over with a grin. "You know Madison, the girl in front, asked me if you were going to give another speech today." Malik squinted. "Didn't she used to think I was mute?" Tyler chuckled. "Yeah, well, now she thinks you're the school's secret public speaker." Malik laughed under his breath, no longer hiding it. It was small but real, and it wasn't shy. It was proud of being seen. Class started. Miss Kent entered, holding her lesson plan with that usual stern face. But today, if you look closely, her steps were just a little slower, and her eyes held something unfamiliar, hesitation. She began teaching as always, her voice clear, her tone exact. But something had shifted. That quiet, invisible authority she used to carry, it felt thinner now, like it wasn't enough to fill the room. Maybe it was because now there was one student she could no longer control with silence, and Malik felt it. He didn't challenge her, he didn't stare, but his presence was different now, undeniable. He was no longer shrinking into the background. Halfway through the lesson, Ms. Kent paused. Then surprisingly, she turned to the class and said, "Does anyone have a good example from last week's writing assignment? Anyone at all?" A beat passed. Then she added, "Malik, would you like to share?" The room shifted, not because she called on Malik, but because for the first time she meant it. Malik blinked, slightly caught off guard. Then he nodded. He read slowly, clearly. This time, there was no dramatic tension like yesterday. There didn't need to be. It was just a solid paragraph, well written, thoughtful, exactly what was asked. When he finished, no one clapped. They didn't need to. Heads nodded, pens scribbled. They listened to him the same way they would to any top student. And Ms. Kent? She stood still for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you. Well done." 2 words. But for the first time all semester, they didn't come with conditions. At lunch, Malik was reading alone when a small group approached. Madison, Aiden, and yes, even Jaden. This time they weren't loud or teasing. They asked him about his writing, his notebook, how long he'd been doing it. Madison, who once ignored him completely, asked, "How long have you been writing like this without anyone noticing?" Malik shrugged, since everyone was busy looking somewhere else. They laughed, not at him, but with him. And from the classroom window, just barely visible through the glass, Miss Kent stood watching. Her eyes settled on Malik sitting at the lunch table, no longer alone, no longer invisible. She didn't speak, she didn't smile. But the way she looked, it wasn't the look of someone evaluating a student. It was the look of someone learning how to see all over again. A week later, Malik's speech was still being talked about throughout the school. Not because it was recorded, not because it went viral, because in truth it never was, but it lived in the memory of those who were there, in the way classmates looked at him differently now, in how a few teachers paused a little longer when they said his name, and in the thoughtful silence that followed every time Miss Kent saw him walk into the room. That day, after school, Malik didn't go straight home. He stayed behind in the library, a quiet place where he'd always written, but never let anyone notice. This time he sat in front of a blank page, not to hide his thoughts, but to hold on to a moment. The day I stopped waiting for someone to say my name, the day I stopped fearing how people looked at me, the day I spoke what needed to be said, and knew someone finally listened. Outside the library window, the sky was shifting to a soft orange. The light of late afternoon poured in across the desk, across his hands, and across the first few words on a brand new page. No one came to congratulate him. There was no award, no certificate, no standing ovation. But Malik smiled, because he understood now Not every change comes with applause. Sometimes it's just a different look, a quiet question, an unexpected invitation to speak, and sometimes the most powerful thing is realizing you don't have to be chosen to stand up.